Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce the Swedish Honorary Consul General, Mr. Lars Henriksson.
Ladies and gentlemen, greetings to everyone in Canada and around the world. Welcome to Raoul Wallenberg, Canadian honorary citizen, Saviour of thousands of Jews in Budapest. My name is Lars Henriksson, and I have the honor and privilege of being the Honorary Consul General of Sweden in Ontario, based in Toronto. To me, there is no other choice. I've accepted this assignment, and I could never return to Stockholm without the knowledge that I've done everything in human power to save as many Jews as possible. This was Raoul Wallenberg's response to Per Anger, a colleague at the Swedish legislation in Budapest on January 10, 1945. Per, who years later would become Sweden's ambassador to Canada, had urged Raoul Wallenberg to leave Hungary and seek safety. Raoul Wallenberg would never see Stockholm again. A week later, on January 17, 1945, he went to meet with representatives for the Soviet forces east of Budapest. He never returned. Instead, he was arrested and eventually brought to Moscow and has never been heard from again. In 2001, the Canadian government designated January 17 as Raoul Wallenberg Day to honor his bravery and humanism. But already 1985, Canada had honored Raoul Wallenberg by making him the country's first honorary citizen. In a report from the Swedish government, 2003, investigating Raoul Wallenberg's destiny, we can read the following, and I quote, "He did not ask what needed to be done. He did not need a decision-making process in the face of evil. His unnerving moral compass indicated the path that he should take. Raoul Wallenberg thus set an example. He knew that we need not always be prepared to do what is right. He showed that we are all able to meet a challenge." End of quote. Wallenberg's humanitarian achievements live on, reminding us that every individual has a responsibility in the fight against racism and for human rights. It shows the importance of personal courage and taking a stand, because one individual can make a difference. In his statement on Raoul Wallenberg today, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says, "Today, I encourage all Canadians to reflect on Raoul Wallenberg's remarkable story and ask themselves how we can embrace the values in our personal lives in order to build a more equal, safer, and fairer world." On this very special day, we are proud to share with you our contribution to many events across Canada. Raoul Wallenberg, honorary Canadian citizen, Saviour of thousands of Jews in Budapest. The program is built around a video with the same title produced by George Preger, whom you will meet a little bit later in the program. After the video, George will discuss it with Urban Ahlin, Sweden's ambassador to Canada. However, before we show the video, we are fortunate to have contributions to the program from a range of speakers in Sweden, the US, and Canada. Our first speaker is Linde. She has a long career in working with and for the Swedish government. First, in significant positions as advisor and state secretary to various ministries. In 2016, she was appointed Minister for EU Affairs. Since then, she has also held portfolios of Nordic cooperation and foreign trade. In 2019, Ms. Linde became Swedish Minister of Foreign Affairs.
Dear friends, I'm most honored to commemorate the deeds of Raoul Wallenberg together with you on this day, the date of his fateful arrest in Budapest in 1945 by Soviet troops. I understand that since 2001, this is also a day of his remembrance in Canada. By my side today is Erik Pettersson, the Charge d'Affaires of Canada in Sweden. Next to us is a framed copy of the bill awarding Wallenberg honorary Canadian citizenship, recently donated to Sweden. It certifies that the government of Canada in 1985 made him the country's first honorary citizen. We are very grateful for this gift and are currently looking for a suitable placement for it at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Right outside the entrance of our ministry, there is a stone bench with a bronze cast briefcase wearing the initial of Raoul Wallenberg that serves as a place for contemplation and for us working at the ministry and for those passing by. This day offers an opportunity to remember an exceptional and courageous person who, with brave initiative and calm commitment, succeeded in saving thousands of Jews from Holocaust by issuing them with protective passports. It is essential that we never forget such moral courage, and it's equally important that we draw inspiration from it in the world we live in today. We have only recently witnessed how fragile our democracies are. The fact that Raoul Wallenberg was granted honorary citizenship in Canada, as well as in numerous other countries across the globe, testifies to the universal recognition of his actions. The 17th of January should also encourage us to reflect and react on contemporary forms of violation of human rights that might pave way to new injustices, abuses, and even mass atrocities. Prime Minister Levitt has decided to host an international forum on Holocaust remembrance, Holocaust education, and combating anti-Semitism and social media that is preliminarily scheduled to take place the 13th and 14th of October 2021, after having been postponed due to the corona pandemic. Over the decades, the Swedish government has, together with relatives of Mr. Wallenberg and scholars, made extensive efforts to find out exactly what happened to him after his arrest. Regretfully, many aspects of his fate remain unknown to this day, which is why Sweden continues to facilitate the efforts of those who are trying to establish the missing facts. Finally, I would like to express my appreciation for the close and valuable cooperation Sweden has with Canada in defending human rights globally and promoting democratic development around the world.
Thank you, Minister Linde. Our next speaker is the Honorable Irwin Cotler. He was recently named Canada's Special Envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Mr. Cotler is an international human rights lawyer, emeritus professor of law at McGill University in Montreal. He is a longtime member of Parliament representing a riding in Montreal, including being Federal Minister of Justice and Attorney General. Mr. Cotler is also founder and chair of the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights.
Good evening. May I begin by commending the Swedish ambassador to Canada, Urban Allen, as well as Holocaust survivor George Preger, for convening this important commemorative assembly in remembrance of and in tribute to Raoul Wallenberg. Our center, the center that I chair and which I co-founded with Holocaust survivor and peace laureate Elie Wiesel, is named in remembrance of and in honor of Raoul Wallenberg, the Swedish non-Jew who is Canada's first honorary citizen, as he is also an honorary citizen of the US, Australia, and Israel, and who was characterized by the United Nations as being the greatest humanitarian of the 20th century. A person whom, as we say at the Raoul Wallenberg Center, demonstrated how one person with the compassion to care and the courage to act can confront evil, prevail, and transform history. From mid-May to the beginning of July 1944, 440,000 Jews were deported to the death camp Auschwitz, the cruelest, most efficient, most mass murder deportation in all of the Holocaust. Raoul Wallenberg arrived in mid-July 1944 at the Swedish legation in Budapest. And from then until the beginning of 1945, Raoul Wallenberg, through a combination of courage and commitment, of bravery and bravado, saved 100,000 Hungarian Jews. So what the bystander international community could not and did not do from May 15th to the beginning of July 1944, one person who mobilized all the resources for that purpose saved 100,000 souls. It says in our Jewish tradition, but in others as well, but as our sages put it, if you save a single life, it is as if you have saved an entire universe. Raoul Wallenberg saved 100,000 Jews. And in the course of doing so, he also foreshadowed what were to become the foundational principles of international human rights and humanitarian law. First, in his distribution of Schutzpasses, diplomatic passports which gave their recipients diplomatic immunity, and in the establishment of safe houses, diplomatic sanctuaries, which gave its inhabitants diplomatic protection. Raoul Wallenberg foreshadowed and effectively gave expression to what we today call diplomatic immunity, diplomatic protection, and the implementation of diplomatic remedy. He became a role model for what protective diplomacy is all about. Second, in protecting civilians and protecting civilians amidst certain atrocity and death, Raoul Wallenberg gave expression to what today we call international humanitarian intervention, the doctrine of international humanitarian intervention, which he embodied in the course of his courage and commitment. Regrettably, the person who saved so many was not saved by so many who could at so many different times. And so it still remains for us to discover the truth about the fate of Raoul Wallenberg, to bring truth and closure for his family and loved ones, to bring truth and justice to the international community's understanding of the fate of this great hero of the Holocaust and hero of humanity.
Thank you, Mr. Cotler. Back to Stockholm. Cecilia Åhlberg is Senior Advisor of the Raoul Wallenberg Academy for Young Leaders, an important organization to encourage youth to act in the spirit of Raoul Wallenberg.
On the 17th of January, 1945, Raoul Wallenberg got into his car together with his driver, Vilmos Langfelder. They were going to go see the general of the Russian Red Army. He had a Russian escort, but when he gets into his car, he tells his colleagues that he doesn't know if he's a guest or a prisoner. That was the last time he was seen in freedom. He was taken by the Russians, and to this day, we're still trying to find out the truth about his fate. There are lots of wonderful human beings who have helped the family to try and find out the truth about his fate. 3 of them are today's speakers, Professor Irwin Cotler, Suzanne Berger, and Sessler. And I would like to thank everyone for making today so special. And thanks to people like you and survivors like Preger, who have created awareness about Raoul all over the world. He has become an honorary citizen here in Canada, in Australia, in the US, Israel, and in the city of Budapest. There are schools, streets, parks, and squares named after him. Statues have been erected, stamps have been issued, and there are humanitarian prizes being handed out in his name. He is a hero because he saved a lot of people during the Holocaust. Raoul had been in Hungary since July 1944, trying to save people being sent to their death, innocent men, women, and children. When he arrived, he started working straight away. He sends letters home to his mother saying that they work day and night, sometimes on the train station, preventing people from getting onto the trains going to Auschwitz, but sometimes at his desk, writing letters to officials. He did anything possible, trying to save as many lives as he possibly could. But he did not work alone. He hired a lot of people, and as errand boys or secretaries, caretakers in his houses. In the end, he ran an organization of approximately 400 people. Raoul created the famous Schutzpass that saved thousands of people. And at the embassy was also working Preger. He later became the ambassador to Canada from Sweden, and he helped make Raoul become an honorary citizen of Canada. At the end of the war, when it was very dangerous in Budapest, Preger told Raoul he needed to get out. But Raoul replied that he could not leave until he knew that he had done his utmost to save as many people as he possibly could. Raoul never came home. But now, the parliamentary bill of him becoming an honorary citizen of Canada are coming to Sweden, and they will be on display at the Foreign Office in Stockholm for diplomats to be inspired by Raoul's action, and that is such a nice gesture. Thank you to the Swedish Foreign Minister Linde for receiving them, and I know that you will take good care of them. Preger and Raoul were good friends even before they got to Budapest. And Per was also engaged in the Raoul Wallenberg Committee in Sweden, together with my grandmother, Nina Lagergren. My grandmother later took the initiative to start the Raoul Wallenberg Academy, and we help young people find their inner compass and to be good leaders. We use Raoul Wallenberg as a role model and his actions as an inspiration for the next generation of leaders. During difficult times like these, with the pandemic, conflicts, and the climate crisis, we can seek strength from Raoul. He can be an inspiration to all of us. Raoul Wallenberg only used pen and paper instead of guns to fight a war against murderers. He had a briefcase where he kept the ledger of people with Schutzpasses, the book of life. this briefcase has become a symbol that one person can make a difference. Everyone can try and make a difference. It could be writing a letter to your local politician about unfairnesses, or preventing a friend from getting bullied, or going on a school strike like Greta Thunberg did. It could also say to say stop when you hear a sexist or racist comment, or to stand by someone who is alone. Raoul Wallenberg is a role model, and he teaches us that one person can make a difference, and he gives us strength to do good. Because as Emma Watson said in the UN, if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? Thank you.
Thank you, Cecilia, for your very important and very interesting comments. Back to Canada. Our next speaker is Michael Levitt. Since September 2020, he is president and CEO of Canadian Friends of Seaman Wiesenthal Center for Holocaust Studies. Before taking up his current position, Michael was a member of Parliament for 5 years. During his time in Ottawa, he was a member of the Raoul Wallenberg Parliamentary Caucus on Human Rights.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Levitt, and I'm the president and CEO of the Friends of Simon Wiesenthal Center. On behalf of FSWC, thank you for including us in today's program, honoring the heroic efforts of Raoul Wallenberg. Our namesake, Simon Wiesenthal, believes strongly that the Holocaust was not just a Jewish tragedy, but a human tragedy, and that if we are collectively to be able to learn from the horrors of the Holocaust, we have to understand how some people could turn a blind eye to the hatred, and yet others would risk their lives for complete strangers. These lessons are echoed by survivors of all genocides. How come one act of kindness or courage could mean the difference between life and death? Through an ongoing partnership with the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights and the In Conversation with a Survivor speaker series, we ensure that the voices of survivors are preserved and heard around the world. We can all draw inspiration from Raoul Wallenberg's courageous acts in the face of insurmountable odds, the willingness of one man to risk his life for another. This message is perhaps more pertinent today than ever. With the rising tide of racism and anti-Semitism, both at home and abroad, it's important for all of us to stand up when someone is being targeted for who they are, to speak out against discrimination, racism, and hate in all its forms. Let us remember, hate against one of us is hate against us all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. For our audience outside Canada, here is a brief course in Canadian Constitution. Irwin Cotler and Michael Levitt were elected to the House of Commons in Ottawa. However, the Canadian Parliament also has a Senate. Therefore, we are delighted to have the Honorable Linde Frum among us today. She was appointed to the Senate in 2009, representing the province of Ontario. Senator Frum has been a fierce advocate for human rights in Iran, and she is also the chair of the United Jewish Appeal in Greater Toronto.
Hello, I'm Senator Linde Frum, and I'm pleased to be participating in today's event because the story of Raoul Wallenberg is a timely reminder of the meaning of real courage in an age when that word has been so devalued. The heroism of Raoul Wallenberg reminds us that authoritarian regimes of any kind must be stood up to, whether it was the Nazi regime from which Wallenberg saved so many Jews, or the Soviet regime which imprisoned Wallenberg and almost certainly murdered him, or the Chinese regime of today, which is currently holding 2 innocent Canadian men in prison and is doing to the Uyghurs what the Nazis did to the Jews. The story of Raoul Wallenberg is both inspiring and tragic. It is a story of a man who risked his life to save others from a murderous state, only to lose his own life at the hands of another heinous state after the Nazis had been defeated. How difficult it must have been to do what he did, what real courage it took, when just as easily he could have stood aside, like so many others did, and watched the Hungarian Jewish population being marched off to concentration camps and certain death. When other good men did nothing and let evil thrive, he acted. He saved thousands upon thousands of people, and he paid with his own life. That is courage. Something far simpler is asked of us, something that involves no risk and no courage. We are asked, or it could be said we are tasked, with keeping faith with his memory and the model that his memory serves, just as he kept faith with our people in his lifetime.
Thank you very much, Senator Frum. Back to Sweden. Georg Sessler was born in Hungary and is a child Holocaust survivor. He now lives in Sweden, where he is a distinguished photographer, artist, and author.
Thank you for inviting me. My name is Georg Sessler, and I was born in Budapest 1943 and came to Sweden as a refugee 1956. And I worked as a photographer, author, and artist. I have written a book, a documentary novel, and was published 2006 in Sweden. The title was I Live Even Though I Was Born, a Jewish family in Budapest 1956 to 1941 to 1956. On the cover on this picture is my brother and me. I am the nice-looking little one in the pram. As my mom was hopping for a girl, I wearing a pink sweater. The photograph was taken 1944. Because my brother was 7 years old at that time, he had to wear a yellow star. The book is the same period when Wallenberg was active in Budapest. In 2009, I got a scholarship from the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I have spent most of my time since studying Raoul Wallenberg heroic deeds in archives in Hungary, Sweden, and US. I speak Hungarian and Swedish, and read German, English, and reasonable Russian. During the research, I have discovered interesting and important information. One very important is that Wallenberg threatened the gendarme, Colonel Laszlo Ferenczy, that he should be executed as a war criminal if he did not change his behavior. During the early summer deportations, Ferenczy's gendarmes, together with SS Obersturmbannführer Eichmann, has sent 450,000 Jews to the gas chambers in Auschwitz. At the end of August, Ferenczi, the Regent Horthy, Wallenberg, and the Jewish Consul together managed to stop the deportations of 200,000 Jews from Budapest. It was a very successful campaign. And Ferenczi's team, even after that, continued to assist Wallenberg until the Russians liberated Budapest. But the important question is, why did the hero Raoul Wallenberg disappear? The same time when we know that German Nazis, war criminals survived in the Soviet prison system and the Gulag. So the question remains, I believe the answer is Wallenberg's Marshall Plan was an important factor. To return stolen riches, factories and farms to the legitimate owners was not acceptable. Is for the direct criticism and threat to the communist system in Eastern Europe. Wallenberg disrupted the relations between Sweden and Soviet Union. He had to become politically very uncomfortable for both. The credit negotiations were underway in Stockholm for 1 billion Swedish crowns. At the same time, Sweden handed over 1,500 refugees in Soviet Union. The Swedish foreign minister, Günther, did not want to understand that returning Russian defectors could be done in exchange for Wallenberg. Ambassador Söderblom informed Stalin that he believes that Wallenberg has been murdered by the Gestapo agents, which was a lie of the Hungarian propaganda channel Kossuth Radio. No one took responsibility for Wallenberg's life after the war. The Swedish government did not dare to make demands of Soviet Union, and Wallenberg was executed in Lubyanka prison 1947. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Sessler, for your very interesting remarks. We are now going to listen to Suzanne Berger, originally from Germany. She is a coordinator of the Raoul Wallenberg Research Initiative. Suzanne is a graduate of the American University in Washington, D.C. Her research addresses the wider political and economic aspects of Wallenberg's humanitarian mission to Budapest. For 6 years, she served as a consultant to the Swedish-Russian Working Group on the fate of Raoul Wallenberg.
I am very honored to have been asked to participate in this beautiful event and to pay tribute to Raoul Wallenberg and the humanitarian spirit he so wholeheartedly and bravely embodied. As you know, before Wallenberg arrived in Hungary in July 1944, more than 500,000 Hungarian Jews had already been deported and killed over the past 6 months in one of the swiftest and most brutal actions of the Holocaust. Wallenberg's mission was backed by the United States and the Swedish government, but it had no organizational plan to speak of. Yet in the hell that was Budapest in the second half of 1944, Raoul Wallenberg somehow managed, with crucial support from his colleagues and from representatives of the neutral countries, to protect, house, and feed the nearly 120,000 Jews left in the city. His fiery determination inspired others, including the many unsung heroes of the Hungarian resistance who have not been properly recognized. Thousands of not so ordinary citizens risked their lives every day on behalf of their fellow human beings against overwhelming odds. Raoul chose to leave behind his comfortable life in Sweden, in the process creating hope for others where none existed before. He worked day and night, driving himself to exhaustion, maximizing every option for rescue and ignoring the threats to his own life. At the end of the hostilities, Wallenberg's name was on everyone's lips. There was an almost instantaneous outpouring of emotion from survivors who grieved when he disappeared and who held a moving memorial service for him. Wallenberg's colleague in Budapest, the late Ambassador Preger, once said that what made his friend different is that he was a true humanitarian. Raoul's extraordinary spirit, his almost reflexive determination to jump into the fray to help others, the raw courage he displayed, physical and moral, is the enduring legacy that has captured our and the world's imagination. And for me, it is precisely this spirit that makes Raoul Wallenberg so special and so rare. His mission was true humanistic philosophy in action. He showed us that if we really want to protect our core values as human beings, if we want to counter horrendous crimes like genocide, every one of us is called upon to take a stand, to draw a line in the sand, one that cuts straight across all ideological, religious, and ethnic boundaries. We all know how truly difficult that is. Activism all too frequently imposes a brutal price on those who dare to take a stand. Unfortunately, Raoul himself was no exception. 76 years after he disappeared, we still do not know exactly what happened to him in Soviet imprisonment. Through 7 decades, his parents, his brother Guy von Dardel, his sister Nina Lagergren, and now the next generation, have continued the search for Raoul as a sacred duty. Determining the full circumstances of his fate is undoubtedly difficult. But we should keep in mind that the search for historic truth is not just a laborious and potentially futile exercise. Instead, it is a vitally important process, especially for members of democratic societies. Together with remembrance, it is the key step that enables us to learn from the past, to avoid making the same mistakes over and over. So we will continue our efforts as a matter of principle and as a matter of justice for Raoul Wallenberg, for his family, and for the millions of victims of repression like him, past and present, who do not have a voice. I hope you will join us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Suzanne. Very thoughtful and very interesting. Now I would like to introduce George Preger more formally. He was born in Budapest 1936, survived the war in Hungary, and after the war and studies in Central Europe, came to Sweden and lived there for 20 years. In 1969, he and his family moved to Canada, first to New Brunswick and then to Toronto and Ontario. In 1985, as chair of the Swedish-Canadian Chamber of Commerce, George accepted the certificate recognizing Raoul Wallenberg as Canada's first honorary citizen. Realizing the importance of keeping the memories of Raoul Wallenberg and his deeds alive, George took the initiative to produce the video that he will now introduce.
Hello, everyone. My name is George Preger, Preger jury in Hungarian. I survived the Holocaust as an 8-year-old boy in Budapest and in the Hungarian countryside. I'm honored and humbled that the 14-minute video I and a group of dedicated videographers last fall and summer made has become a focal point of today's celebration to honor Raoul Wallenberg's memory and legacy. Why did we make this movie? Good question. I met in my life 2 special people, that's why, who made an impression on me. Long ago in Stockholm, I met Kalman Lauer, who was my stepfather's friend. Kalman ran an import-export business in Stockholm, and he loved to meet us in the best of restaurants to eat good food. Unknown to me at that point, Kalman was the person who had hired Raoul Wallenberg and arranged for him to start working at his food business and later in the Swedish legation in Budapest in order to save Jews. The operation was partly funded by the US government. Kalman never talked about this, but I found out much, much later. Fast forward to Toronto. 20 years later, after moving to the town, I became professionally involved with several Swedish companies. In due course, I became chairman of the board of the Swedish-Canadian Chamber of Commerce. In this capacity, I interacted with the Swedish ambassador Per. He was a career diplomat who had worked hand in hand and very closely with Raoul Wallenberg in Budapest during 1944-45. Per. was an extremely modest man who always put Raoul Wallenberg's name first. Both of them were granted the title of righteous Gentile among the nations by the State of Israel. The video will tell the story of how a Canadian MP, Roland de Cornet, tirelessly arranged for Raoul Wallenberg to become Canada's first honorary citizen. Berger came especially to Canada for this event from his retirement. For me, the meeting with Carmen Lau and much later with Berger coalesced in my mind to make this movie. I have now also discovered later that another person in the Swedish community here in Toronto had met Raoul Wallenberg as a student in Stockholm, and while both were prisoners in the Soviet Union. It was Niels Kalin, the founder and former chairman of the Swedish Canadian Chamber, and he also worked for SKF in many countries. His son, Fred Kalin, who lives in the Toronto area, has his diaries. Niels Kalin never spoke to him about his experiences either in Japan during the war. In my opinion, these stories must be told and inherited by the coming generations. Ladies and gentlemen, I trust you will find the video interesting.
Life in Hungary in the 1930s was good. Family members shared pleasant moments and good conversation. There was laughter, joy, and happiness as people celebrated their lives. Parties and trips to the beaches were common then, just as they are today. Attention was on the beauty of Budapest in the warm summer days. Still, Europe was at unease. Political deals were being forged and shattered. Betrayal was on the doorstep. People thought of their future and where they would be in another year. The comfort of warm days and close friends was coming to an end. The Jews of Budapest were at enormous risk, and few were willing to raise a hand of courage. There were friends, though, and as we look back at these days through the prism of time, several men stood out for their valor and commitment, for their own acceptance of risk to help those who committed no crime other than they happened to share a religious belief. Canada provided honor for those courageous souls. One man in particular, Roland de Cornet, firmly pushed ahead with his plan to posthumously recognize one man with the honor of Canadian citizenship. The person accepting this award on behalf of the man lived through the horror of the Shoah. He accepted the honor with humility, pride, and a sense of gratitude that such a man was present at the time. Our story is about those men. In 1934, a young Swedish student hitchhiked across the United States. In a letter to his grandfather, he explained traveling this way gave him an understanding of diplomacy and tact. In 1936, returning to Sweden with a U.S. college degree, he started work with a firm owned by Kalman Lauer. The student was Raoul Wallenberg. In 1938, the Hungarian government passed a series of laws fashioned after the German Nuremberg race laws. These laws inevitably led to the persecution of Jews in 1944 as the Nazi forces invaded Hungary, seizing power and control from Miklos Horthy. This humanitarian crisis received the attention of Franklin Roosevelt, who dispatched Ivar Olsen to aid the Hungarian Jewish crisis. Olsen met Wallenberg and assigned him to a Swedish legation to Budapest. With the assistance of fellow diplomat Berger, the two men established a plan to issue Schutzpass, identifying the bearer as a Swedish subject. These protective passports were the foundation for saving thousands of lives. This is a story of Raoul Wallenberg and Berger, as told by George Preger. It is an uplifting story in the face of overwhelming pain. It is a story, as told by Mr. Preger, of Canada's recognition of a young man who eventually gave his life in the midst of saving others he had never even met.
He did not believe in murder. He did not believe in killing people because they belong to a certain ethnic group. The Holocaust has to be remembered forever. I think that humankind has still not learned, unfortunately. Since then, we've had the killing fields of Cambodia, we've had Rwanda, now we have Syria. We have to be constantly reminded that acts of human kindness are very, very important.
An honorary Canadian citizenship is not undertaken lightly. There have only been 5 such honors given, the first being granted to Raoul Wallenberg in 1985. To receive such an honor posthumously is of great significance. To being the individual receiving it in honor of the recipient is deeply moving. George Preger was such a person receiving the award on behalf of Raoul Wallenberg.
The Germans actually entered Hungary, I believe it was on March 17, 1944. Hungary was a German ally, but they wanted to establish a separate peace with the Soviet Union, and that is why overnight they were occupied by Germany. My father was away from us a lot of the time. He was in Hungarian uniform. He was initially in a labor company as an officer. When that unit was sent to the Ukraine, he went AWOL, and then he resurfaced as a Hungarian officer with false papers, and he visited us from time to time. And I was the son on paper of my German governess, and my mom was her half-sister on paper. And we were hiding in a village in Hungary as ethnic Germans. And I was a German speaker from the get-go, as was my mother, so we had the German language perfectly. Let me tell you, if I wouldn't have understood, I wouldn't be around in the first place. I had to understand. I was highly trained, and I highly trained myself. I knew the markings of every Russian soldier's or every German soldier's uniform, what unit they came from, what they did, what they didn't do, what to expect, what not to expect. I think that the whole Jewish community in Budapest particularly was very grateful to Raoul Wallenberg and Sweden, because they did provide essential food supplies where otherwise many people would have starved to death. And just to give you an example, in the book it's described that Berger himself was so hungry that he and members of the Swedish legation helped to butcher a dead horse so that they would have some food to eat. All my relationship to Berger, I knew him well. And the reason for that was that at the time when he was Swedish ambassador to Ottawa, I happened to be the chairman of the board of the Swedish Canadian Chamber of Commerce. And he knew that I was a Holocaust survivor from Hungary. He always undersold his own role. He was very, very modest. But I can tell you that there is a Holocaust memorial to him as a righteous Gentile right next to the memorial dedicated to Raoul Wallenberg himself. Raoul arrived in Hungary, it was on July the 9th, and visited the 76-year-old regent, Admiral Horthy, the de facto caudillo of Hungary, with a letter from King Gustav V of Sweden, urging clemency for the Jewish people. Admiral Horthy was skeptical and somehow dismissed it. So the Swedish legation started issuing Schutzpässe. These were really forged passports to the Jews, and these passports were printed locally. Everything was done locally. It is amazing in how many cases these fictitious documents claiming the bearer to be a Swedish subject influenced the brutal, murderous Nazis. In the Battle of Budapest, Raoul Wallenberg was arrested by officers of the KGB, and we don't know if he was murdered or still in the Gulag. In conclusion, it has to be said that Raoul Wallenberg was perhaps the most righteous of Gentiles, saving Hungarians, Jews, at great peril to himself. Preger worked very closely with Raoul Wallenberg throughout this episode in history, and that's why he knew very exactly what Raoul Wallenberg was doing. One of the greatest deeds in the 20th century to save a part of humankind in the middle of terrible atrocities, not only perpetrated by Germany, but also by the Soviet Union. I was very humbled. I felt perhaps that there could have been worthier individuals to receive this honor, but Preger insisted that I should be the individual, so I very humbly accepted the honor on behalf of Sweden. Karl Lutz, the Swiss charge d'affaires, Angel Sans Brise, called the Angel of Budapest, Chinu Sumihara of Japan, who saved 6,000 Jews in Kaunas, Lithuania, Selahattin Ülkümen of Turkey, who saved 700 Jews, Hiram Bingham IV, who saved and rescued 2,500 Jews in Marseille, France. And then there is a German diplomat who was actually a member of the Nazi establishment in Copenhagen, who alerted the Danish Jews and the underground that the Jews were going to be arrested and deported, as a result of which over 90% of Danish Jews were ferried across to Malmö in Sweden. A volunteer who hasn't been mentioned before, and he was a Czech immigrant organizing the Canadian stamp for Raoul Wallenberg. The Reverend was by birth Swiss. He was a member of parliament, I believe, by the Liberal Party, and he was very involved in multi-faith interaction between different groups of Canadians, and this was very important for him. Here in Canada, we are a compassionate and sharing society. May we never forget the lives of the 6 million men, women, and children who symbolize this day. They were demeaned, brutalized, tortured, and killed horribly en masse by human beings who committed these unspeakable crimes without any remorse whatsoever. Let us recall not only their death, but even more so, the splendor of their lives. May the memory of their lives inspire us to hallow and sanctify our own lives, and to help us ensure that they shall remember forever and ever. Amen be amen.
As the daughter of a Hungarian survivor, whose home was next to the Swedish legation in Budapest, for me, in biblical Hebrew, Ruel is friend of God. Raoul accomplished his name.
Thank you, George. The story you told us in the video is very important, and we must never forget its message. Now George will be joined by Urban Ahlin, Sweden's ambassador to Canada. Before coming to Ottawa in 2019, Ambassador Ahlin had a long career as a member of Swedish Parliament, including being Speaker of the Parliament for the period 2014 to 18. George and Urban will carry on a conversation about the video and the message and what we saw.
Thank you very much, Lars. And first of all, I would like to say to you, George, on behalf of the Swedish Embassy, that we are extremely thankful for the outstanding work you are doing in highlighting the work of Raoul Wallenberg, the values, the deeds, and the courage of him, and that inspire us every day. So thank you very much for keeping us on the toes all the time at the Swedish Embassy here.
Thank you, Urban.
You're so welcome. As you mentioned in the video, you were only 8 years old when all this happened in Hungary. And I must try to make this a little bit personal and ask you, how much did you really understand about what was going on when you were 8 years old? And you said in the video that you know all the signs of the different soldiers and so on. So explain to me, how much could you really understand about what was going on in Hungary?
Well, the way it was, my father was a very perceptive person. He had served in the Austro-Hungarian army in the First World War as an officer, and then later lived in Berlin in the 20s and until 1930. He saw what was happening in Germany, the change to the Nazi regime and what was coming. He was very observant. He understood to train me already in about 1942, when I was a 6-year-old, what was coming by at night shaking me up, flashing a light into my eyes and saying, "Who are you? What's your name?" I was trained to learn the Catholic prayers in Latin and the catechism, and to start learning my future persona during the Holocaust. So by being prepared in that way in an early age, I was able to cope with the challenges thanks to my parents, which were coming. And unfortunately, many other Jewish families did not realize what was coming, did not prepare for themselves, and were consequently caught in this horrible situation that ensued.
So you mean your father, he really had a sense about what was going on and he trained you. You mean that you exercised during night, coming in with a flashlight, and you had to tell which is your fake name, so to say, and say certain things in German and so on to really make it, call it, trustworthy that you were the person that you wanted the Nazis to believe you were. I mean, well, it's an amazing story that I think lots of kids around the world actually should understand, what it means to have been living during this period of time and being forced to live through that. So how did that affect you as a kid? I mean, 6, 7 years, 8 years old in Hungary, having this knowledge, being trained, it must have been terrible, walking around nervous all the time about what's going to happen.
Well, yes, that's true. The thing is that one had to be trained when there was a razzia and the Aerocross thugs would interview you, that you gave the right answers. Otherwise, they take you to the courtyard and shoot you in the head. And during one of these razzias afterwards in the morning, we did see a beautiful young girl and her father being executed lying there in the courtyard. But they had passed us over, sort of believing that we were Gentiles. So one had to be extremely, extremely careful. Now, yes, this has carried over with me for all my life. It is, of course, a terrible burden to carry something like this with you.
but it also teaches you certain things of how to be perceptive of what may happen without taking away your optimism. It is a burden for you, for your spouse, and for your children, because anybody, I think, who has lived through the Holocaust, their families become very much aware of it, and it's not always easy.
I can understand that. You have told me about, can you call it an incident, when actually one of the Nazi leaders suddenly asked your mom to come and interpret in German, and later on wanted to come to your house. So tell me about that.
Well, you see, we were known as ethnic Germans in this village of Felschurgud. And then what happened was that a German troop train arrived at the station, and they needed an interpreter to speak to the Hungarian railway people. And my mother was picked up by a couple of gendarmes in a motorbike. She actually got very scared because she thought that we'd been found out and that she was going to be deported to Auschwitz. It turned out that they needed an interpreter. So she got to the station, and a polite German Sturmbannführer, sort of a major, said, "Heil Hitler, I'm such and such. We need an interpreter. Would you please help us?" And my mom did her job. And then the major said, "Well, would you mind if we came to visit? We won't disturb you. We'll do our own cooking in the yard and perhaps play a little bit of music." And my mother said, "Well, of course, Herr Sturmbannführer. What else could she say?"
What else could she say? Yeah.
Right? And well, they did come. And a few 20 minutes later, a corporal knocks on the door and brings piping hot food, lamb, chocolate, coffee, vegetables, fruits, stuff we hadn't seen for well over a year, and said that maybe please invite you. So friendly terms developed, and this guy, Sturmbannführer Hans Monewich, became friendly, and we saw each other throughout the Shoah, throughout the Holocaust. He would come and visit. He actually met my cousin, who was at the time 16-year-old, and fell in love with this girl. At one point, where we had already all retreated into Budapest proper, the girl and her mother, who was my aunt, and another aunt, they were hiding in a bunker, and then the building collapsed on top of the bunker due to the bombing. So he found out and went over there and dug them out with his tanks and brought them over to us. At some point, I think he probably started to suspect that we were Jewish. He never said so. But at any event, later on, my father was serving in the Hungarian army. He had no choice. He was hiding in the Hungarian army. And the military police got very suspicious of his identity, and they brought him in for questioning. My mother was crying. Hans happened to come by in the bunker, says, "Wilma, what's wrong?" And Mom said that, well, they've taken Peter, that was my father's not real name. They've taken him to headquarters, and I don't know what's going to happen. So Hans said, "Well, Wilma, we're going to fix this." So he drove over there with a platoon of tanks, went up to the room where Dad was being kept, and said, "Gentlemen, what do you want with my colleague, Lieutenant Petrus? We served together on the Russian front." Not a word of this was true.
So he lied really to save your father there. Yeah?
He did, and he did save my father. He did save my father. Then when the last day or day and a half before the Russians took over the city, he came to say goodbye. And he said that my job is to shoot any German who's to be left behind to save, to defend the city. But then the tanks are breaking out. And that happened. We later found out that his tank was damaged, and my dad and my uncle was a Russian speaker, went from POW camp to POW camp until they found him. And they vouched to the Plukovnik, the colonel, what this guy had done. So no SS usually came back from there. but Hans, who was wounded, his wounds are taken care of, and he was repatriated to Germany after 3 years, which was almost unheard of. Then he phoned my cousin, wanted to marry her, and she said, unfortunately, no, which was a real pity because he was a good guy. So this is a story which is the exception, I think, right? But it has to be told that even, among this horrible group of people, there were people who tried to do good. So that's the story.
Oh, it's a fascinating story. Before I was appointed ambassador here to Canada, I was the speaker of the Swedish Parliament. And in the Swedish Parliament, Riksdagen, we have a certain room that sometimes is called the Raoul Wallenberg room, but it is actually the room of good deeds. And when I was the speaker, I had the honor to have the Wallenberg family there, Nina Lagergren, Cecilia.
Wonderful.
Earlier in the program, when they actually deposited the Congressional Gold Medal that Raoul Wallenberg was given from the American Congress, and we had a big
That's
event.
amazing.
And the reason why we have this room is actually because we have so many visitors, youngsters, coming by Swedish Parliament and learn about democracy and talk to politicians. But we want them to go through this room and realize is that as a certain individual, you can do lots of good. And we really try, to let the kids go through there and really see what the do and what is the history about him. So what do you think is the most important message for if we look upon the youngsters? We are living in a very kind of strange times where we see atrocities, as you mentioned in the video. We also see a lot of hatred. We see politicians actually use hate as a political tool. So what is your message to the young generation about the future, and how should we be inspired from Raoul Wallenberg today?
Well, Urban, that's a very good question. It's a question which I asked myself. And I also asked the question as a matter of fact, when I was in Vienna, from Simon Wiesenthal himself, because early days I was a volunteer for Simon Wiesenthal here in Toronto. I had the opportunity to meet Miss Simon. It was a wonderful meeting. And I asked him, Simon, what do you think is the most important thing for us to do? And Simon said to me in his German, Georg, the most important thing is to inculcate the children at an early age, pre-teens, early teens, before they learn this hate, to accept human kindness, to accept the fact that we are all human beings, that we should not hate each other on the basis of race, religion, orientation, or religion. And that is what I think we have to carry forward. I think this is how we have to, not only as organizations, but as individuals. As I think that one of the speakers said, just saving one life can change the whole world. And I think it is that should be our daily job to make this world a better place by teaching youngsters to love their fellow men and not to discriminate against them based on religion or color or religion or ethnicity or anything else. That's my answer.
When I was the speaker, I also had the opportunity to go on an official trip to Israel. I was invited by the speaker Edelstein at that time. And part of the program was to visit Yad Vashem, the museum in Jerusalem. And I was so fascinated by the outlay of the museum because it starts with the propaganda from the Nazis where they were dehumanizing the Jews and other people they didn't like. So, making pictures of Jews like they were cockroaches or rats or pigs, and in kind of all the communication, just making them not human beings. and by that paving the way for what was going to come later on, the Holocaust and the final solution, as they said, the Nazis, And I think that is important, as you mentioned, that we are human beings and we need to treat each other as human beings. But we can also see that this kind of hate and dehumanization is also going on today, George.
Yes, this is very, very unfortunate. We have to be very, very aware of it. Today, we read about and see pictures of racial hate, sedition, insurrection, even in the United States, particularly in the United States today, systemic denigration of minorities and ethnic cleansing, which is a euphemism for mass murder. We see the invasion of sacrosanct public institutions invaded and democracy destroyed. As you mentioned, the final solution, if you will, it was very plain to read in Adolf Eichmann's book, what Mein Kampf, what was going to happen. The world read it and did nothing. Right? Further, Hitler's propaganda chief, as you mentioned, Joseph Goebbels, demonized the world Jewish and Roman population, cockroaches, der Jude Zeus, and so on, painting them as disgusting human beings. So the final solution, when it followed, was accepted by regular Germans who, in effect, because of this seasoning, became co-conspirators. So I think there we have the answer. Then we have, of course, Arnie Schwarzenegger, who speaks about this. He recently spoke about this on YouTube when he said that growing up in post-war Austria, where his parents' generation, who had just stood by and said nothing, was so frustrated, depressed, that domestic violence and drunkenness was commonplace. This is why he finally left for the United States. So, there we have it. Now, sorry, go ahead.
No. It was a very strong message from Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Very strong.
I actually retweeted it myself because I really think he hit the nail there. And as you say, he mentioned about his own fathers and the neighbors, how they were drunk and so on, because they had this enormous guilt and the problems that came from it. So it was a very strong message. And I also think that the message was about that when you hear a political leader talking about different groups of people, like they are racists or they are rapists or they are criminals and they are not, worth anything, they are lousy and so on, then you should be vigilant. Because if there is something we can learn, it is that it can happen again. And isn't that the reason why we are doing all this commemorating Raoul Wallenberg? Because we should never forget.
Well, absolutely. We should never forget. And we've seen some horrible pictures of the Capitol in Washington being raided, invaded, Confederate flags being waved around in the Capitol itself by, I hate to call them, white supremacists. So obviously there's a huge problem here. And we have to remember what is actually said in the Hebrew Bible about this. What it says is, if we go to Genesis chapter 18, verses 1-8, what it says in there is that Abraham is visited by the Almighty, is visited by God at the supreme presence. Suddenly, 3 strangers arrive, and Abraham leaves the presence of God to rush out to greet these visitors so that they are welcome to his home, fed, and abode is given to them. You would think that this would be an affront to the Almighty, but the opposite is actually the truth. The the lesson in the story is that the most important thing ahead of anything else, and our rabbis actually confirmed this, is to help our fellow human beings when the need is there. And not only that, the mitzvah, the honor, is not for the people receiving the benefit, it is for you for being given the opportunity to help other people. That is the big thing. So I think that each one of us has a moral responsibility to ourselves to help fellow human beings in need, as important as it is for organizations like, the Simon Wiesenthal Center, the UJ, B'nai Brit, the Wallenberg Center for Human Studies, etc., Muslim, African Canadian, and indigenous and Christian organization to help others. Each one of us on a daily basis should be thinking that we have to help our fellow men.
Thank you very much, George. It's a wonderful
You're so welcome.
Conversation. Thank you, George. Over to you.
Thank you, Urban.
Well, thank you, gentlemen, for a very interesting and meaningful conversation. It's very important, and the movie very moving as well. To build on what Urban and George talked about, and also Cecilia brought up, bringing the message to the younger generation and the importance of making them aware of the deeds, memories, and values of Raoul Wallenberg is very, very important. Therefore, we are delighted to have Jurisic, a student at the Etobicoke School of the Arts in Toronto, a high school student, with us today.
Thank you for being here. My name is Max Jurisic, and I'm a grade 10 musical theater student at Etobicoke School of the Arts in Toronto. I would like to start by a land acknowledgement that I'm speaking to you from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. In 1984, the Canadian Parliament passed a bill awarded to the first ever honorary Canadian citizenship to the great Swedish citizen, Raoul Wallenberg, for saving 100,000 Hungarian Jews from being sent to gas chambers by the Nazis in 1944 and 1945. Yet now, 75 years later, the world is still witnessing racial hate in the form of anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, discrimination of people of color, ethnic minorities, indigenous people, and people who identify with the LGBTQ community. In my own city of Toronto, hate crimes have risen by 42% this past year. As a representative of the next generation with Swedish heritage and the grandson of George Preger, a Holocaust survivor, I have been asked at the behest of the Swedish ambassador in Ottawa to remind my own generation and to encourage the upcoming generations to help create and sustain a just society. We as individuals are responsible. It is up to each person to educate and learn about the past atrocities and current ones in order to advocate for the inequitable future for all, whereby regardless of socio-economic class, race, gender identification, we live by principles based on respect, inclusivity, and love. We must not tolerate hate in any form.
Thank you, Max, for your excellent comments. And again, I want to quote Prime Minister Trudeau's statements from earlier today. I quote, "We will also continue to keep alive the memory and the stories for younger generations and work to promote and defend pluralism, inclusion, and human rights." End of quote. Max, listening to you, I know that we are in very good hands with the coming generation. You and your fellows are very important as ambassadors to keep Raoul Wallenberg's memory alive. We are reaching the end of the program. Lars Ruth, the current chair of the Swedish Canadian Chamber of Commerce, will give some closing remarks. And after Lars, Moshe Hammer will perform the Jewish prayer called Nidre. Lars, please.
Thank you, Lars. On behalf of the Swedish Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I want to thank everyone involved for producing today's event and all our great and engaging contributors. A special thank you, of course, to George Preger, our ambassador, Urban Ahlin, and of course, our great host, Lars Henriksson. But I also want to give a great thank you to the people behind the scenes. So the Chamber's Executive Director, Marie Larsen, for all the work she put in, and our very skillful and engaging social media team, who's achieved great success in getting our message out. A little shout out also to our production team of Brian Smith with UN Media and his team members, Elvis Dean and Andrew Kynes. I also want to say a big thank you to our sponsors who helped make this possible, the SKF, Nuvia, and Svea in Toronto. But most importantly, a great thank you to all of you who attended today. As you have learned, there are several historical ties for the Swedish Canadian Chamber of Commerce and Raoul Wallenberg. And we intend to continue an annual commemoration of Raoul Wallenberg on this day, January 17th. We want to invite all of you to help shape this event. So you're hereby invited to collaborate. You can submit feedback and suggestions to our special email address. It's rw@sccc.ca. So rw@sccc.ca. We'll put this email out in the chat as well, so you can pick it up from there. In conclusion, we will now hear Moshe Hammer perform the Jewish prayer called Nidre. I want to thank you all again for attending today.